Some cases are loud. Everything is right there in front of you. What happened, how it happened, who was involved. And you guys do that every time you listen to Murder in the Black. You either know the true crime case that I'm covering and I'm expanding on a particular section inside the true crime case, or if you're the true crime sleuth that I think you already figured it out within the first 5 minutes. And you can follow it and feel like you've got a handle on it, even if the case is heavy. And then there are cases like the one we're going to explore today, where what happened after starts to feel just as important as whatever took place in that room. It's not just the moment someone dies, it's what comes next. Who keeps talking? Who suddenly has answers? Who keeps moving like nothing really stopped? And when you start paying attention to that part, the steps, the choices, and follow through, it shifts how you look at everything. You hear one version of events, you see another. And neither one fully cancels the other out. But they don't sit easily together either. And that tension, that's where today's story lives. Kwaneta Harris was born in 1972 and raised in Detroit, Michigan by her mother, grounded in structure, expectations, and what most people would call solid values. By 1991, after graduating high school, she immediately got married to her high school sweetheart. Her husband joined the Air Force, and that decision took them overseas to England. But life moved fast, as it often does. By 1993, after the birth of her son, the marriage began to fall apart. What once felt like a new beginning started to unravel, and eventually, they divorced. This is where Michael Giles enters the picture. Michael grew up in Louisiana. According to his sister, his one goal in life was to join the military and travel. He was someone who always wanted more out of life, to build something, and he did just that. He joined the Air Force, traveled, worked on planes, and enjoyed his deployments throughout the 90s. At one point, he was actually the supervisor over Kwaneta's husband. That's how they first crossed paths. And after her marriage ended, she turned to someone familiar, Michael. What started as a connection turned into a relationship. Kwaneta and her son moved in with him, but eventually that didn't last. The relationship fizzled, and she made a decision to return to Detroit, enroll in school, and start over. And for a while, it looked like she did just that. She filed for divorce, became a registered nurse, and started building a life that felt stable. By 2001, she had a daughter. And by 2002, at 30 years old, she was living independently, managing motherhood, caring for her own mother, and doing everything. But let's be real for a minute. Sometimes responsibilities can feel heavy. It's a load, and she needed an escape. She decided to reach back to Michael Giles. By 2002, Michael had transitioned out of the Air Force. He was working at Southwestern Bell. And y'all, what a throwback. Southwestern Bell. And I guess you guys have to keep me privy to what it was in the Midwest and in the North and this part of the country, right? Because I know they dominated in those other regions. But in Texas, it was Southwestern Bell in the Southwest states. And then down south, it was South Bell. When I found that out, I was just like, oh, this is so throwback. If you know, you know. If you don't, let's move on. Now, he got a job working at Southwestern Bell, and he was pursuing his master's degree and bought a home in Garland, Texas, using a VA loan. He remodeled it, made it his own. He was living comfortably, not flashy, but stable. He was careful. He didn't want anyone taking advantage of what he built. He dated, but it was casually until Kwaneta came back into his life. And they quickly rekindled things. You see, Kwaneta was like the one who got away for Michael. And when they rekindled their relationship, it was getting back something he wanted to hold on to. So, how would they arrange their relationship with her living in Detroit and him being in Dallas? Well, she would fly to Dallas to visit him and he would cover her hotel expenses. They would spend time together. When they weren't together, they stayed connected, sending pictures back and forth. Flirtatious, intimate, spicy. For Kwaneta, the relationship she had with Michael represented the spontaneity that she was trying to receive at 30. He represented a new version of herself that put aside being a mom, being totally disconnected from Detroit and her responsibilities back at home. And he represented freedom from those responsibilities she had. Their relationship was going strong. But this relationship, it wasn't exclusive. Back in Detroit, Kwaneta had a boyfriend named DeAndre, someone she had known since high school and recently reconnected with. So now we have overlapping lives, overlapping relationships, and no clear boundaries. It's unclear if Michael was aware that Kwaneta had a boyfriend back in Detroit and if DeAndre was aware of her romantic relationship with Michael. But before we move on, I want to pause here for a second. This case feels close to home because for me, it is. I'm from Dallas, and if you've been listening to me for a while, you already know how I am about that. A Texan through and through, baby. But I don't just want to tell you what happened. I want you to be able to see it. And what I'm doing right now isn't necessarily deviating from what I do in other cases about cities that I'm not fully aware of or don't know much about. So I want you to be able to see it, to understand the spaces these stories move through, and who better to narrate that than a person from the city. So when we're talking about Garland, Texas, this isn't just some far off place. Garland sits right outside of Dallas, depending on where you are. You can get there in about 20 to 25 minutes, maybe 15 miles out from the city of Dallas. And if you're not from here, it might sound like a completely separate city, but in real life, all of Dallas blends together. Dallas is big, and I don't just mean population, I mean spread out. You've got all these surrounding cities, Garland, Plano, Richardson, Mesquite, Oak Cliff, and they connect in a way where you can cross from one into the other without even realizing it. So something happening in Garland isn't removed from Dallas. It's a part of the same rhythm, the same daily movement. People commuting back and forth, working in one city, living in another, running errands, raising families, building routines that stretch across all of it. And the neighborhood where Michael lived was not chaotic, not the kind of place where you would expect something like this to unfold. It's quiet, residential, the kind of area where people take care of their homes, where things feel steady, predictable, low crime rate, which makes what was sitting in that backyard feel even more out of place. Because when something like this happens in a space that feels normal, it hits different. Now you might be saying, Steph, wait, hold on. Where did you go for a second? I'm giving you context because remember, I said Michael lived in Garland. Now, let's see what was in his backyard. On October 12th, 2007, Garland Police Department is called out to a home, not because of anything sinister, but because of a foreclosure. The VA had been trying to reach the homeowner, Air Force veteran Michael Giles. He never missed payments until suddenly he did. They hadn't heard from him since July of 2006. That's over a year. So they moved forward with the foreclosure, but when investigators arrive at the home, something feels off. In the backyard, there's a slab of concrete, random, completely out of place. And it's just a small size of concrete. It was awkward, and it wasn't connected to anything. And immediately, one of the investigators looks at this as he's surveying the backyard and asking the current renter questions. This concrete slab looks like a grave. Now, the current renter was asked a question if he knew Michael Giles, and he claimed that he didn't. Instead, he mentions a woman, Kwaneta Harris. He claimed that when he rented the house, she was the owner who gave him the keys. But when investigators talked to the mortgage company, They realize they have no idea who she is and the mortgage has not been paid. There's no way possible this Kwaneta Harris person is the owner. But investigators are now curious. What they see in the backyard and what this renter is claiming, it doesn't make sense. And the renter actually mentions one other thing. He says that he has been trying to get in contact with Kwaneta, but was unable to because he wanted to make changes to the property, but she won't return his call. Things are starting to look suspicious. The first detective, who believes the slab of concrete found outside in the backyard was a grave, decides to retrieve cadaver dogs on scene. They post several different poles throughout the backyard, and the cadaver dog goes to the concrete slab and starts to scratch. They know they need a warrant because that means the cadaver dog has smelled human remains in that area. They need a warrant, but to retrieve a warrant, you need to present evidence to a judge that substantiates probable cause. Investigators reach out to Michael's family, and they claim they hadn't seen or heard from Michael in over a year. I know you're probably judging a little bit. You're probably judging and saying, what do you mean you haven't heard from him in over a year and you haven't seen him? It doesn't jive. It doesn't make sense. Why haven't you filed a missing persons report? But reserve your judgment because let's talk about their last contact with Michael. According to Michael's mother, on the 4th of July weekend in 2006, she called him and asked him if he would come over because she cooked. And he said he was just going to cook at home and that he would eventually come by later that weekend. However, he never showed up. That same month, maybe a week or two later, his mother and his sister decided to come by his house. They knock on the door. No one's there. They go to the back of the house. They can't find anybody on the property. But at the back of his house, there was a window. And inside that window, his sister sees that the furniture, all of his furniture in the house, was gone. His house looked abandoned, and they were worried. Now, it wasn't just only his mother and sister who went by to check on him. It was several other family members as well. But remember, July of 2006 was the same month he stopped paying his mortgage. Everyone is dismayed. They feel like something's going on with Michael, but they don't know what. But a couple of days after his mother and sister went to his home, they received a text message. And the text message essentially said, "I'm okay. Don't worry about me. I'm traveling." And that text gave them some reassurance that he was okay. But it wasn't the text entirely that helped them to rationalize his disappearance, to help rationalize his absence. Instead, they were able to go back to what recently occurred in Michael's life. Recently, Michael had been laid off from Southwestern Bell. Now, the one thing I told you about Michael is that he loved to travel. And Michael was pulling from his Air Force pension. He was working that Southwestern Bell job. And so although he had been laid off, he still had reservation of funds and he could go and travel for a while just to put his mind at ease before he ultimately pivoted. So when they got the text message accompanied with the fact that he was recently laid off, it helped them to rationalize in their minds that he was okay. And several family members got the same text message as well over the next couple of days, and they felt like he was traveling, although they were very suspicious after a year that he was still gone. As detectives are hearing what the family is saying, they decide that they need to subpoena his bank records to see if there was any activity that substantiated the fact that he was traveling or if he was indeed truly missing. Once they retrieve those bank records, there's no activity consistent with travel. Instead, they come upon the same name from the renter, Kwaneta Harris. Kwaneta Harris was on all of his accounts. And recently, his car title was transferred over to Kwaneta. and she took his car back to Detroit. When they find this out, they really believe that Kwaneta has something to do with this scenario and Michael's disappearance because she just keeps resurfacing in this case. They go back to the family and they ask the family about Kwaneta. They said, is your brother involved with someone? She's on all of his accounts. The renter at his house is now saying that Kwaneta Harris is the owner. Can you give me any details about who she is? The family came back with no answers. They said Michael was a very private person, that he didn't bring just anybody around his family. They had to be special. But he was private about his life, who he dated casually or committed. He kept that to himself. And that was the sentiments of everybody, including his sister and his cousin. Now, I want you to tuck that under your hat for the end of the case because I want to circle back to that idea of privacy. Now that detectives know Kwaneta Harris has something to do with it, to what extent their relationship manifested, they didn't know, but they knew that this looked shady. Something in the water just ultimately wasn't clean. And since they didn't find in his bank records any sign of him traveling, they did believe, in fact, he was missing. The police go and file a missing persons report and receive the search warrant to search and excavate the slab in the back of Michael's yard is completed, and they have the authority to investigate. In addition to finding out about Kwaneta, looking at his bank records, they find out there was a 911 call from July 11th, 2006. A neighbor reports seeing several people go in and out of Michael's home, and they didn't see Michael, and they were carrying furniture. And so she calls the police because she thinks this is a robbery. Now, this is where being a nosy neighbor can work out for you. When the police arrive, the story changes, and Kwaneta Harris comes out of the house and she tells them that she is helping her godfather move. He is out of town and traveling, but he has given her the authority to go in his house and sell his furniture. As a result of the police coming, a report was generated. And inside of that report, the men that were moving the furniture, the police made a note of their license plate number. The police have a record of the furniture that his sister and mother saw that was out of his house is now connected to this Kwaneta Harris. They follow up with the men who were on the scene moving the furniture. And it was two guys. Their names were Vic and Juan. Vic was the uncle and Juan was the nephew. But these are adult men. According to Vic and Juan, they had a landscaping business and were approached by Kwaneta as they were working on a different neighbor's lawn. And she came over and said, I have some furniture that I'm selling. I'm selling it for cheap. It's a lot of different items. Would you want to buy it? And they said, sure. They go over to the home and buy every piece of furniture with the exception of one piece, the mattress. On the mattress, according to Vic, was a red stain. And he was hesitant to buy it because it didn't look like it could be washed out. It looked permanent. She tried to tell him that's just a red wine stain. It can come out. But he opted to not buy the mattress. And immediately as the detectives are hearing this information, they believe that what was found on that bed was not wine, but it was blood. Although they didn't buy the mattress, they bought everything else for $300. So investigators were now on track to believe that this was not just suspicion. There was something definitely about Kwaneta Harris. But before Vic and Juan left, Kwaneta asked them if they would go in the backyard and dig a hole. This hole was the same hole that was eventually covered by the concrete. And they said that as they were digging the hole, they joked about it being a grave. You know, whose grave are we digging? At the time, this story sounded strange. Even to Juan and Vic, they had a healthy amount of suspicion about her selling them this furniture for dirt cheap. there being a stain on the mattress, and then her asking to dig a hole. But despite them feeling weird about it, they did it anyway. But later, it would mean everything. Before we move on, let's just cover what the police have uncovered about Michael's disappearance so far. So far, Kwaneta Harris is on his financial accounts. She also has his car. She sold all of his furniture. She rents out his home despite not paying the mortgage. There's this suspicious mattress, and then there's a hole in the backyard, and now there's concrete. At this point, she becomes the number one suspect. And so the detectives know they need to split their efforts. Two detectives go to Detroit, Michigan to talk to Kwaneta, while a forensic team goes forward with police to execute the search warrant in the backyard and excavate the concrete slab. In Detroit, they find Kwaneta at her home that she shares with her mother. And she talks freely. She says she is concerned about Michael. She knows about his disappearance. And she explains their relationship. Because up until this point, Kwaneta has claimed to be his goddaughter who has been taking care of his affairs. But they don't really know what it is because the family could not give a solid definition to their relationship because they were unaware of any romantic partnerships that he had. So she tells them, yes, me and Michael were romantically involved, and they had been dating back to the 90s in England. And she gives context to how their relationship started. She says that they didn't simply connect after her divorce or her separation from her ex-husband, that they had an affair while she was still married to her husband. She claimed, when confronted about her name being attached to all of his financial accounts, that the daughter that she gave birth to in 2001, well, that was his child. Instead of going through child support in a traditional way, they opted to just have her name on all of his financial accounts so that if she needed to get money for support, she could easily do so with no problems. Kwaneta had an answer for everything. Honestly, her explanations were reasonable, but detectives wanted to make sure they kept Kwaneta talking. They were essentially stalling for the investigative team in the backyard excavating the slab to tell them if they found anyone or something. Finally, the investigators get the call. They found him, or what was left: bones wrapped in a blanket, and a pillow was included in the burial. And a medical examiner was on scene who saw a hole in the skull that matched a hole in the pillow. The working theory, according to detectives, is they believe that Kwaneta attacked him while he was asleep, placed a pillow over his head to nullify the sound of the gun, shot, and killed him. They had everything they needed in order to confront Kwaneta in that moment. However, investigators opted to bring her down to the Detroit Police Department. And they asked her if she didn't mind coming down and answering up more questions about Michael, and then she would be on her way. She agrees. In the interview room, they confront her with the truth they uncovered, that Michael is no longer missing. They found him in his backyard. And the friendly person that they found on the doorsteps of her home was no longer there. She disappeared. She simply asked for her lawyer and stopped speaking. Now, she was extradited back to Dallas to face a murder charge, but that's not where the detectives stop. They secure a search warrant to search her home in Detroit. Inside, they found a lot of Michael's personal belongings: his wallet, his social security card, phone, computer. And on that computer, in the search history, they found how to clean blood, how to bury a body. They also found a notebook with all of his financial passwords. Now, Michael had been missing for over a year, and in that time, she had withdrawn up to $200,000. She paid her bills, her mother's bills, put her daughter in private school. Now, one of the things that the investigators did is they called the financial institutions of all of the accounts where she was listed and had access to Michael's accounts because they were trying to figure out how was she able to gain access. Now, just like in 2007, online banking was a thing. She would go online, secure access that way, or she would do it over the phone, or simply she would forge Michael's name and go into the bank and gain access. And she was able to do that seamlessly with no kickback because the protocols they had in place then allowed for her to do so. However, one of those banking institutions didn't. When she walked in the bank with all of the paperwork she needed to put her name on Michael's account, the banker told her, no, you can't simply just walk in, even with the papers, and ask for me to put you on the account. I need to see Robert and I need to see him sign these papers. She, thinking quickly, told the banker that Michael had been in a severe car accident and he was unable to come to the bank. And she didn't know what to do because without her assistance, he would not be able to pay his bills and essentially live. Now, this banker felt like he was doing the right thing. And he said, well, hey, listen, I can come out to your house. And if I can see Michael and he's able to sign these papers in front of me, you're good to go. She sets up the appointment. And when the banker walks in, inside the living room, he sees a hospital bed in the middle. And there's a person he perceives to be Michael in the bed. And he never sees this person's face because they're wrapped up with bandages. The individual presumed to be Michael is not readily communicating. It's almost like he can't, but he's batting his eyes. He's trying to communicate with the banker. And the banker understands from Kwaneta that he can't at this time. But when it came to signing that paperwork, his hand, well, it worked. The banker was convinced that it was Michael. With this story, police are stumped because what they know about the time that this paperwork was executed, Michael was laying in his backyard underneath a concrete slab. If it wasn't Michael, then who was it? Police believe it was DeAndre Knight. Quick pause just in case you're locked in right now. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to Murder in the Black and you press that bell icon so that you can keep up on our updates. For exclusive episodes and subscriber-only content, consider becoming a paid subscriber. And here's a little nugget. We have a 3-day free trial on Apple Podcasts just in case you want to figure out the lay of the land first before you commit. And Storytime with Steph is back. That is where I present many true crime stories you won't always hear on our main feed, but the stories deserve to be told. And you can watch that on whatever social media platform you enjoy us on. But I especially want those of you who are on TikTok to know that I'm back. And this is where we started our Murder in the Black community. One more quick favor. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoy the work here. Let's get back into our story. Kwaneta's boyfriend from high school. Detectives fly back to Detroit to talk to DeAndre, and very quickly, DeAndre confesses to fraud. He said that he participated in several scams with Kwaneta over the years, but he denies killing Michael. Now, I want you to tuck that under your hat as well, because during the trial, we'll come back to DeAndre and his involvement in this crime, if at all. But the one thing detectives noted is that they didn't believe he was involved in Michael's death, but they believe he had knowledge of it. When he participated in the fraud, they believe that he knew that Michael was indeed dead. Ultimately, they believe he had nothing to do with Michael's murder. By 2008, Kwaneta is not sitting in Lusterix County Jail in downtown Dallas. She made bond. Her bond conditions was she couldn't leave the Dallas County area until her trial ended. She secured herself an apartment and laid down roots in Dallas because she didn't have another choice. However, the case is building against Kwaneta. And after Kwaneta was bonded out of jail. The Crime Stoppers start to receive heavy tips that come in that essentially Kwaneta did not kill Michael. In fact, it was Vic and Juan. And you remember Vic and Juan, those guys who purchased the furniture, dug the hole that Michael inevitably was put in. And they start to get just an overwhelming amount of Crime Stopper tips about these guys. Now, they do their due diligence, they look at it, but it just seemed unusual because it was the same tip coming from different people. But on April 24, 2008, something unusual happens. The judge that presided over Kwaneta's case was in court. He was in the middle of another case. And a woman walks into his courtroom and she makes a beeline to the bailiff. Now, we know there are different protocols and measures that you have to go through in order to speak to the judge. Well, she just can't seem to wait. And so she tells the bailiff that she needs to speak to the judge immediately. And as this bailiff is trying to calm her down because she seems nervous and anxious, the judge sees the interaction. And so he speaks up from the bench. He says, "Excuse me, ma'am, can I help you with something?" And she said, "Yes, I need to talk to you. Are you the judge presiding over Kwaneta Harris's case?" And he says, "Yes, that's me." She made a bold claim. She said that Kwaneta Harris was innocent and she was guilty. She killed Michael. This young lady's name was Erica Flores. She was 19 years old. I can't imagine the day that this judge had after Erica came in and blew up his entire world. Not to mention the DA or the detectives who were on the case who had no idea who she was and were called down to the court to hear Erica's story. According to Erica, she was chilling with Vic and Juan, the landscapers. They were out in Garland. They went to a shopping center. They decided they were going to hit a lick. For those of you who don't know what a lick is, it's a robbery. They start scouting potential victims out in the shopping center, and they see Michael Giles. They decide that he's the target. They follow him back to his house, and as he's retrieving groceries out of his car to put into his house, they gain access to his house. And inside the house, Erica pulls out a gun, grabs a pillow, and shoots Michael. Now, what a phenomenal story. I mean, this is just extravaganza in the worst way possible. Detectives and the DA are kind of scratching their head. Like, is this real? Is this not? Detectives start to ask her more questions. How old is Juan? She just waits a moment and she says, "Oh, Juan, he's about 19 years old." And then she tries to explain a physical description. And they say, "Hold your horses right there. Juan is 57. What's going on here? Do you really want to tell us the truth? Because now we know that you're lying." Erica breaks. She admits that someone paid her to lie. And just when you thought this story couldn't get more extravagant, in the worst way, don't forget that, it does. She claims she applied for a private investigation position. She met up with the woman at a community college in downtown Dallas, El Centro College. They went to the library and she conducts this interview with the woman hiring her. She claimed this woman had a Jamaican accent. This woman then begins to explain the duties of a private investigator for the position that she wanted to be hired for. Essentially, this woman claimed that she worked for the Texas Attorney General. She claimed that they were conducting a secret investigation. And a part of their mission was to see if the district attorney office was treating Black defendants differently than white defendants. The theory was if they hired you, you would walk in and falsely confess to a crime to see how detectives treated you. She claimed that they will arrest you, but after a couple of days, someone from the Texas Attorney General office will come down and pick you up and compensate you for the time that you had to sit in jail. And there will be no repercussions for falsely confessing. because the Texas Attorney General office would take care of all that paperwork. But after she told this fantastical story, the only question that the DA and detectives had for her was, who is this lady who told you the biggest lie of the century? And she mentioned that she had a Jamaican accent, so she began to describe her. Detectives went to their photo lineup, pictures of various different perpetrators, but also a picture that included Kwaneta Harris. Now, Kwaneta Harris had no criminal background outside of her pending charge of murder against Michael. They used her license picture. They find out through Erica that Kwaneta was wearing a disguise. She was wearing a wig. She didn't look exactly how she looked in this picture. Let's face it. We know that your license usually doesn't expire for a couple of years. You can drop weight, pick up weight, change your hair, change your entire look, right? But those features traditionally remain the same. It was a bit of a challenge trying to figure out exactly who it was, but ultimately she identified Kwaneta Harris as the woman who carried out this elaborate manipulation in order to ultimately clear herself. Yeah, that bond that she was able to post, well, that was revoked. They rearrested Kwaneta and charged her with tampering with evidence, coercion, manipulation leading to a false statement. And she received no bond. If you're anything like me, you're wondering, what happened to Erica Flores? Was she charged? She wasn't. After the truth came out, they believe that she was psychologically manipulated by Kwaneta, and she was released. Trial begins October 6, 2009. And right away, this is the kind of case, especially if you're new to true crime, where people pause. Because there was no murder weapon, no DNA directly tying Kwaneta to the moment Michael Giles was killed. Nothing you can pinpoint and say, this right here proves that she did it. And for a lot of people, that's where doubt starts. But in court, that's not the only way a case is built. What prosecutors had here was everything around the act. And sometimes that matters just as much. Because circumstantial evidence, when people hear that, they think, oh, that's just weak. Guesswork. Like, it's all just assumptions stacked together. But that's not what it is, especially in this case. This is probably one of the best hard-hitting murder cases that I've come across in a very long time, where although there is no murder weapon or DNA tying Kwaneta to the murder, the circumstantial evidence is damning because it points out a pattern. It's about what the actions show when you line them up, one after the other after the other, and asks if there's any reasonable explanation that fits all of it. In this case, the pattern was hard to ignore. She had access to his accounts and used them. She sold off his belongings. She had people removing furniture from his home. She asked for a hole to be dug in the backyard, the same area that was covered with concrete. The title of his car is transferred to her. She drives it back to Detroit. Money is being moved consistently. His family hasn't heard from him, but texts are still going out. And she's in possession of his cell phone. Individually, you might be able to explain one or two of these things away, as she did with detectives in her first interview when she was talking about the name being on the account because they shared a child together and it was just easier. Well, that seemed to make sense. But all of the choices that she made, she didn't have an explanation for them that fit. But together, all of these things and choices that she made, it starts to close in. And that's what made this case ultimately strong. Not just one piece, but all of them, layered, consistent, pointing in the same direction, directly at Kwaneta Harris. The defense tried to redirect that. And to be honest, their motive would hold up if it weren't for one thing. That one thing I told you to tuck underneath your hat and we'd come back to in the trial. Well, the defense pointed at DeAndre. They said he had motive, that he already admitted to fraud, that he was capable of stepping into Michael's identity. And when he found out that Michael had a romantic relationship with Kwaneta, it was more than what he could take. And they claimed they had receipts of travel, of DeAndre coming down to Dallas, and that he was the person who executed the murder of Michael, not Kwaneta. They also offered an explanation, one that was rooted in taking accountability. They claimed that they did not want to argue about some of the facts of the case, that Kwaneta had spent upwards to $200,000 of Michael's money, that she stole all of his financial passwords, putting her name on all of them. But all of those choices were rooted in the fact that she was terrified of DeAndre. And she felt like she had no other choice but to do what he wanted to do in terms of fraud and stealing Michael's money. Now, on the surface, without me giving you this nugget of information I'm about to, this gives you something to think about. It makes you have a pregnant pause. Except the investigators, when they talked to DeAndre, they checked his alibi. And although DeAndre admittedly came to Dallas, he wasn't in Dallas when Michael was last believed to be alive, which was the weekend of July 4th, 2006. DeAndre was at work. This narrative that DeAndre was the person behind the curtains controlling everything, well, it starts to fall apart. At that point, with the trial moving forward and everything laid out, Kwaneta and her defense team go to the DA for a plea deal. Because, baby, it's looking bad. Kwaneta was trying to avoid life in prison because if she let the trial play out, the jury had a decision to make, and they could possibly sentence her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And along with the DA and the family, they reach a plea deal. Kwaneta is sentenced to 50 years in prison with the possibility of parole. In Texas, that means you're serving at least 80% of your sentence before you even see the parole board. So she would have to serve 40 years before even being eligible. Not guarantee that they'll let her out. Michael's family agreed to the deal, but they had their hesitation, as they should, because even when a case feels strong, closure doesn't always feel complete. And usually, this is where our story ends. I give you a reflection or a takeaway, and then we end the episode. But as we have seen with Kwaneta, she doesn't give up easily. In 2013, something happens. Honestly, it sounds like it shouldn't even be real. Like someone tore it out of the script of a movie. A document surfaces showing Kwaneta's sentence has been reduced from 50 years to 8. And for a moment, it looks like everything is about to change. But it wasn't real. It was forged by Kwaneta. She forged a judge's signature. And when that comes to light, it reinforces something prosecutors had been saying all along about Kwaneta Harris. This wasn't just about one moment. It was a behavior of manipulation and lies. Patterns, decisions made over time. Today, she remains in prison, and she'll be eligible for parole in 2033. Now let's fast forward to today, 2026. Kwaneta has gone on to become a published, award-winning journalist. But before we get into that, let's see what Kwaneta Harris has to say about Michael Giles' murder. Now, she has never stood up and said, I didn't do it. That's not her position. Instead, she tells a different kind of story about what happened between her and Michael Giles. In the way she speaks about it, in the way she speaks about it, whether it's in interviews or through her writing, she frames that relationship as long, complicated, and rooted in abuse. She described it as a cycle, one where control and violence showed up over time. She said there were moments where she was shoved, manhandled, and even choked. And when she talks about that night, her version is specific. She claimed there was an argument. He pulled a gun on her. She says she feared for her life. And instead of reacting immediately, she describes calming him down, massaging him, murmuring words of love, waiting for the moment where she could take control of the situation. Then she grabs the weapon and she shoots. That's the picture she paints. Not chaos, not panic in the way people expected, but something quieter, more controlled. A moment where she says she did what she had to do to survive. And also, she's been clear about how she believes that gets interpreted, especially for Black women. She's argued that what's considered standard self-defense doesn't always apply. That Black women, even in situations where they're protecting themselves from long-term abuse, are more likely to be seen as the aggressor. And that conversation, that's real. I agree. There are gaps in how the system understands abuse. There are biases in how cases are perceived, who gets believed, and what self-defense is allowed to look like. That part deserves space. But here's where it gets complicated for me. Because when I line that version of events up against everything that came after, it doesn't sit clean. The financial activities, selling off his belongings, transferring the car and driving it back to Detroit, having someone dig a hole in the backyard, pouring concrete over it. But most of all, continuing life. That's not one decision. And I'm not saying those actions erase the possibility that something volatile happened in that moment, that she did experience abuse over time. But when you zoom out, it starts to feel less like something that spiraled and more like something that was managed, handled, seen all the way through. And that's where the tension really sits for me, because there's a duality here that you can't ignore. On one side, you have a woman who today is writing, publishing, speaking on issues that matter, prison conditions, abuse, systemic failures. Her work is thoughtful, it's articulate, it's reaching major platforms. On the other side, you have someone who manipulated multiple people in this case. She manipulated Erica Flores into walking into a courtroom and confessing something she didn't do. She involved people like Juan and Vic, pulling them into something they didn't fully understand. She deceived banking institutions. She attempted to defraud the justice system itself. That's not small, that's intentional. And when that's part of the record, it changes how you receive everything that comes after. Not in a way that says, none of this can be true, but in a way that makes you pause because something else stands out. The framing of abuse, of survival. It wasn't centered when everything was in the line of court. That was not her defense. But it shows up later. And again, that doesn't automatically make it false, but it does make you look at it differently. Because abuse is real. How many times have I covered domestic violence cases on Murder in the Black? I even had somebody leave me a review and say, there are other cases out here that you could be covering. But let's face it, this is an issue. America, we have a problem, and I'm here to help identify it. So I know, more than most, how much domestic violence captures the space of true crime. It is indeed a problem. It impacts women, it impacts men, it shapes behavior in ways that don't always make sense from the outside. But it also is something people connect to immediately. And when someone who has already demonstrated a pattern of manipulation begins to speak into that space, it raises a question, not about whether abuse exists, but about whether that narrative is being used And I can hold space for both of those things at the same time. I can acknowledge that what she's writing about now matters and still question the person delivering it. Because when manipulation, deception, theft, and violence are all a part of the same story, it's not unreasonable to question motive, even now, especially now as parole eligibility gets closer. Because rebuilding a narrative can also look like preparation for release, for public perception, for what comes next. And that's what makes this case sit the way it does. Not just what happened to Michael Giles, but who Kwaneta Harris has shown herself to be over time. Because the version she offers, it doesn't feel impossible. It just doesn't feel complete. Before I close out this portion of the episode, I want to take a moment to center Michael Giles. Because cases like this can pull your attention in a lot of directions, the details, the manipulation, everything that came after. And without even realizing it, you can lose sight of the person at the center of it all. Michael wasn't just a name in a case file. He was a son, a brother, a cousin, a man who built a life by all accounts he took pride in. He served his country, he traveled, he worked, studied, bought a home, created stability for himself. The kind of life a lot of people are still trying to reach. And the people who loved him, his family, they were left trying to make sense of silence, calling, texting, showing up at his home, hoping for answers, holding on to messages that told them he was okay. And he wasn't. There's something especially heavy about that kind of loss when time passes, when hope lingers longer than it should have to, when the truth is sitting somewhere and no one can see it yet. So while we've talked through the complexity of this case, the questions, the contradictions, it's important to remember that Michael Giles deserved more than how his life ended. He deserved to be fully seen, and his family deserved the truth. Rest in peace to Michael Giles. Now, we're not closing the door just yet, because while that story has an ending, some stories out here still don't. Let's get into true crime and current news. And today's story is one that makes you pause because it's complicated. It forces you to ask how something like this was allowed to continue for so long. We're in Pontiac, Michigan. A mother, Ashlee Jenae, has been sentenced to up to 20 years in prison after pleading no contest to 3 counts of second-degree child abuse. And when you hear what her children were living in, it doesn't sound real. Authorities found 3 children living alone in an apartment. No running water, no working plumbing, human waste inside the home, rotten food, no stable supervision. At one point, the children were using a cardboard box as a toilet. And prosecutors say this wasn't temporary. This was ongoing. Ashlee wasn't there. She was reportedly living elsewhere, only returning occasionally while her children were left to survive on their own. Now, let's slow this down for a second, because this is where it stops being just a headline. When deputies walked into the apartment, they didn't just find neglect. They found children adapting to something no child should ever have to normalize: living in it, sleeping in it, figuring it out. They were still going to school. Well, sometimes. Trying to hold on to some version of normal while living in conditions most adults wouldn't last a day in. And this is where things get significantly heavier. This was not the first time. CPS had been called on Ashlee Jenae at least 4 times before. 4 separate complaints: neglect, improper supervision, and children at risk. Each time, those cases were closed and marked as low to moderate risk. No sustained intervention. At one point, Ashlee was involved in thefts with her children present. We're talking about stealing from beauty supply stores, physically fighting employees, and leading police on high-speed chases. The whole time her kids are present. She steals from the beauty supply store. There's CCTV footage of her getting out the car when the employee comes out to write down her license plate number. She gets out the car and starts fighting the employee. Her children are in the car, and the only reason why the fight stops is because her daughter breaks it up. She then gets back in her car and proceeds to lead police on a high-speed chase while her children are in the car. And even then, that situation was still labeled as low to moderate risk. Now you have to ask, what does it take? Because the warning signs were there repeatedly, and still those children ended up living in conditions investigators described as beyond what's acceptable, even for animals. When it came time for sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. She made it clear this wasn't just about systems failing. This was about Terioma's choices. Terioma's knowingly left her children in unsafe conditions and showed a disregard for their most basic needs. Her defense argued that outside factors played a role: lack of support, housing instability, mental health struggles. But the judge ultimately rejected that argument. Systems can fail. Reports can be made, boxes can be checked, and still nothing fully changes in a way that protects children who need it the most. What is particularly tragic about this case is those children were still trying to show up to the world as if everything was okay, trying desperately to be seen by a system and a mother that completely ignored them, despite having 4 complaints filed against Teriomas Johnson. It's sickening. I pray that those children find peace and restoration after the system has completely failed them and their own mother placed barriers in front of them that they will have to tear down throughout their childhood and adulthood. Let's shift gears for a moment because there's another case that has been coming up over and over again in my messages. A lot of you have asked me to cover this on Storytime with Steph, and I'll be honest, I hesitated, not because it's not important, but because this case has been changing throughout the week. I mean, rapidly. New details, shifting narratives, information coming out in real time. And I wanted to take a step back, gather as much as I could, and bring it to you in a way that actually makes sense. Now, I may pivot after this and do some Storytime with Steph updates surrounding this case, but either way, I will still update in our True Crime and Current News segment because I realize not everybody has social media. And this is one of those cases that you want to keep up with. We're talking about Ashlee Jenae, a 31-year-old influencer who traveled to Tanzania, specifically Zanzibar, to celebrate her birthday and a new engagement. She got engaged on April 5th, her birthday. She was posting, celebrating, living in what looked like a moment of joy. And within days, the trip turned into an international investigation. At some point during the trip, Ashlee was found unresponsive at the resort where she was staying. She was taken for medical care, but she later died. That part is not disputed. What is still being questioned is everything surrounding how that happened. According to the reports, her fiancé told authorities that she died by suicide, specifically hanging. There are references to an alleged belt being used. Medical reporting has mentioned lack of oxygen consistent with strangulation. But here's the part that gets us deeper into this case. There is no publicly confirmed, finalized cause of death yet. Authorities are treating it as a suspected suicide, but the investigation is still ongoing. This is not a closed case. Right now, Tanzania authorities are actively investigating. Her fiancé is being questioned and his passport is being held. He has not been charged with anything. So while there is a working theory, there is also active scrutiny. More details have surfaced that weren't known at first. Reports say the couple had an argument during the trip. Hotel staff allegedly separated them into different rooms, and according to her family, Ashlee spoke to her mother shortly before her death and mentioned the argument and indicated they had been placed in separate rooms. Then her family says they were later told she was stable before learning she had passed. So here's what we know. You have a reported argument, a separation, a death shortly after, and an explanation that arrived quickly but hasn't been finalized. This is where we start to ask questions. When a case is still developing but a narrative is already forming, how do you decide what to hold onto as truth? Ashlee's family is not accepting the current explanation. They've been very clear. They do not believe this was a suicide. They're asking for more transparency. They want access to evidence, including surveillance footage, and they are working to bring her body back home. This isn't just grief. This is family actively trying to understand what happened to their healthy 31-year-old daughter from outside of the country where it occurred. This case is getting attention for a reason. It sits at the intersection of social media visibility, international travel, conflicting narratives early on, and limited access to real-time information for the family. And when all of that comes together, it creates a situation where people are trying to piece together a story while it's still unfolding. If you've been following this case, I want to hear your thoughts respectfully. And stay tapped in because if anything changes, you already know. I'm coming right back here to update it. My condolences go out to Ashlee's family. I'm saddened by her death, truly. But I'm also paying attention to the fact that her case is being discussed on a national level. Because if we're being honest, we don't always see that for Black women or Black people. And this tells me that something is changing, that the work being done by advocacy groups and even podcasts like Murder in the Black is contributing to a larger narrative, one where Black women, men, children are no longer overlooked, but recognized as lives and stories that deserve the attention of a nation and beyond. All right. That'll do it for this week, y'all. That is our episode. And I don't know, I think we might have broke a record today, y'all. This is the first episode where I think it's over an hour long. So if you stuck with me all the way through, you know I love and appreciate you for listening and watching and supporting Murder in the Black every single week. I want to encourage you guys that if you have enjoyed this episode or if you have thoughts, questions, comments that you want to share, don't keep it to yourself. Talk to your neighbor about it, but then come and talk to me over on our social media platforms. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you think, whether it was the true crime and current news segment or it was simply the case that we dissected together. I want to hear from you. And you guys know that we go deeper over on Substack. It's not just a reenactment of what we talked about on the episode. It's a place where we go deeper and have more conversations about facets of the case that I thought were fascinating or just deserved to be talked about a little bit more after the episode. You know, every Thursday we release our full episodes, and then you get a story time with Steph from me on Wednesday. And if you're a paid subby, you know how it goes down. We get down over on paid subscription. I love y'all over there. If you want to be a part of the crew, all you have to do is simply go to Apple Podcasts. We have a free 3-day trial. I'm thinking about opening it up for a 5-day trial, y'all. I don't know. Maybe y'all need a little bit more time. I am dropping something epic in May, and I can't wait. So if there was ever a time you were considering paid subscription, I'm going to just put it out there in the universe. You might want to consider it in May. Don't say I never gave you nothing or told you something, because I love y'all real bad. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black. See you next week.